lesson for November the 28th is entitled, God's Plans for Us. The key verse is Genesis 50:20, which says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." The scripture is from Genesis 50, verses 15 through 26. The lesson focus is God has our good in mind. In the overview, it says that when Jacob died, Joseph's brothers were afraid that Joseph would retaliate for the wrong they had done him. But Joseph assured them that he had forgiven them. He explained that what they had intended as harm, God had used to save many lives. Joseph died without returning to the promised land, but he died confident that God would keep his promise and the children of Israel would return to claim their inheritance. In the introduction, it says that as we conclude our study of Genesis, let's take a quick look at the people we have met this quarter and what they have taught us about God. Genesis begins, appropriately enough, with creation. In the beginning, when God completed his work of creation, he looked at what he had made and declared, "It was very good." Thus began his relationship with the human race. God set a challenge before the people he created. He created them free to choose to be the kind of people who could maintain fellowship with him. But Adam and Eve chose to disobey God, thus breaking their fellowship with him and with each other. Yet even as God confronted them about their sin, he also announced a plan for eventual redemption. The sin of Adam and Eve began a pattern of human disobedience. The world became so corrupt that God destroyed his creation, saving only Noah and his family and the animals with him in the ark. We learned a number of lessons from Abraham, with whom God developed a special relationship, calling him to leave his home and follow him. God led Abraham to Canaan, promising him that the entire world would be blessed through his descendants, a promise that was fulfilled centuries later with the birth of Jesus. Abraham developed a trust in God that allowed him to ask boldly that his nephew be spared when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Abraham's confidence in God and his promises were so strong that he could respond faithfully when asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. At first, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, seemed to be an unlikely candidate for a special relationship with God, yet God used Jacob as a step in fulfilling the promises he had made, promises for the promised land and the promised one. God gave Jacob the name Israel, the name by which the chosen people would be known. Jacob's son Joseph also had a rocky beginning. Our first view of him showed us a privileged, perhaps naive young man, but Joseph chose to serve God, and God gave him success. In part 1, it says that God expects us to forgive those who have harmed us. And the text is from Genesis 50, verses 15 through 18, which says, "When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, 'What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?' So they sent word to Joseph, saying, 'Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father.' Their message came to him. Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. 'We are your slaves,' they said. For 17 years, Jacob and his family lived in Egypt. Those must have been some interesting times. Imagine the hours Joseph spent with his father, each telling the other the story of his life. They had lived apart more than they had together, and there was a lot of catching up to do. Imagine also the conversations that went on among Joseph's brothers. Although Joseph assured his brothers that he had forgiven them, their guilt kept them from accepting that fact. Perhaps Judah said, "Maybe he's just saying that he forgives us to please our father." "You might be right." We imagine one of the brothers chimed in, "We may be in trouble when Dad dies." Jacob died. His family made the trip back to Canaan to bury and mourn him. After this, the brothers came to Joseph, asking for mercy in their father's name. "Your father left these instructions," they said. "This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed." The brothers added one additional plea: "Please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." What was Joseph's response? Joseph wept, just as he had when they first came to him 17 years earlier. And the brothers, still fearful, threw themselves down before him, saying, "We are your slaves." Earlier, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Later, fearful for their lives, they offered themselves as slaves to him. How did Joseph respond to their offer? In part 2, it says, sometimes God allows us to see his purpose in what we have experienced. And the text is from Genesis 50, verses 19 through 21, which says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." Joseph endured almost unimaginable suffering. First his brothers plotted to kill him. Then they sold him as a slave. In Egypt, he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. As a prisoner, he aided his fellow inmates, only to be forgotten by the man who promised to help him. Through all of this, there was the anguish of being separated from his father, his younger brother Benjamin, and even the brothers who betrayed him. How did Joseph find grace to forgive the brothers who set into motion this chain of suffering? And it was grace that enabled him to forgive them. Grace and a keen awareness that God was the only one in a position to judge. "Am I in the place of God?" he asked. Long before Jesus said the words, Joseph observed the principle, "Forgive that you may be forgiven." Joseph reassured his brothers and spoke kindly to them. What a contrast to the brothers' behavior when their jealousy kept them from saying a kind word to him. God had a plan for them, Joseph assured his brothers. Yes, they intended him harm and carried out their intentions, but God had different intentions. He intended to use their wicked plan for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. It is true that many Egyptian lives were saved because Joseph was present to interpret Pharaoh's dreams and to develop a plan for storing grain in preparation for the long drought. Perhaps more importantly, however, God used the wickedness of the brothers to save the lives of Jacob's family, the family through which the promised Redeemer would come. God had promised Abraham that he would possess the land of Canaan and that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. God repeated that promise to Abraham's son Isaac and, in slightly different form, to his grandson Jacob. Joseph saw the big picture. God intended good for his people, not evil. Joseph lived to see God's purposes worked out in the saving of the chosen people. Sometimes, however, God's purpose is not revealed in our lifetime. In part 3, it says, we can trust God's promises even though we do not live to see the end of the story. And the text is from Genesis 50, verses 22 through 26, which says, Joseph stayed in Egypt, along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years, and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at an age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. After he buried his father and then reassured his brothers, Joseph apparently experienced a long period of peace and prosperity. He stayed in Egypt along with all his family, living 110 years, long enough to enjoy his great-grandchildren. Like his father Jacob, Joseph wanted his remains to be buried in the land God promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When Jacob died, Joseph and his brothers had returned to Canaan to bury their father. However, Joseph did not ask his family to make the journey to bury him. Why, we are not told. Perhaps he sensed that leaving Egypt would not be easy for his family, for he foresaw a time of distress, a time when God will surely come to your aid. So Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath that they would carry his bones up from this place, and God would lead them back to Canaan. And so Genesis ends with the children of Israel, not in the promised land, but in a foreign land where they had taken refuge during a time of famine. Here they embalmed Joseph, we are told, and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. It sounds so final, but the story is not finished. God had made promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and God keeps his promises. Of this Joseph was sure, just as surely as God prepared Joseph as an instrument of good. He would see to it the family's descendants would return to the land promised to their forefathers. There's a lesson here for us, too. Just as Egypt is not really home for the children of Israel, we have not yet reached the home promised us. Jesus said that he would go to prepare a place for us, a place where we can be with him forever. And he keeps his promises. Thanks be to God. In today's life application, it says, how confident are you that God has your good in mind? Perhaps one of these exercises will strengthen your confidence in God's promises. Complete a Bible study tracing God's promises regarding the promised land, both the land promised Abraham and the one Jesus promised us. Create a timeline for your life that shows the pattern of God's leading you. Memorize one or both of these promises. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope in a future. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.